I didn't know there'd be a crowd. I would have written something. You know, this is amazing. I think when I grow up, I want to be the curator at the Playboy Mansion, which sounds like... I thought that was Hugh Hefner's job, by the by, the curator. Thank you all for coming. I should tell you that as a child, young man, what I wanted to be was a stand-up. It's a dangerous thing to say. I wanted to be a stand-up comic, but I'm not going to be funny. I wanted to be a comic. I grew up in New Jersey. For a time, my father would take me to the Catskills to see comedians. When I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I had a friend who knew I wanted to be a stand-up comic, and he said, you have to go see this comic. He's at a burlesque house in Hollywood. I think it was called the Zamboanga Club on Yucca. And I said, no, I don't want to go to a burlesque house. What am I going to do? You know, he said, no, you have to go see him. How he knew about Lenny Bruce, I'm not even sure. But I said, okay, I'll go. And I went. And Bruce was performing with a jazz musician named Eric Miller. They were chained together on the stage. This is when, just after Defiant Ones had come out. And I thought he was the most amazing thing I had ever seen. I was a freshman at UCLA. I stopped going to classes. This is a horrible thing to say within earshot of University of Chicago, but I stopped going to classes in the daytime. And at night, I would get up and go to the Zamboanga burlesque house. And at a certain moment, you know, I like being biblical about it and saying, you know, 40 straight nights I had gone. Bruce came to the apron, and they would let me in free after a time. I said, well, okay, kid, come. Bruce said, what are you doing here, man? How come you're here every night? You know? I said, I think you're amazing. He said, well, come out with us afterwards, and we'll talk about comedy. And I can tell you that the act he was doing was improvised. It was amazing because it would change at night, and we would talk about, just over drinks, what worked and what didn't work. And so we remained friends over his lifetime. When he died, his mother gave me all of his papers. I was going to write a biography of him, and I didn't do it for reasons we can talk about. But so here I go. This will be done at 3:30. Then we'll have, if there's time, we'll ask for questions. Okay? No, that's only an hour long. I know it's Shabbos. I would never do that to you. So I've been asked to talk about, let me first say, I want to dedicate this talk to my children from Iowa, from the International Writers Conference, to Lee Jha and Osman and Sohail, and to Chris Merrill. So I've been asked to talk about Lenny Bruce as a subversive comic. I'm happy to do just that. But before I do, I first need to point out an oddity in the language that confounds my task. The Oxford English Dictionary describes the word pervert as both verb and noun, so that a person can both pervert the normal order and also get pegged as a pervert. I should never start a paper with perversion. The same holds true for the word convert. The word works as both verb and noun. The word subvert, the OED makes clear, behaves differently. It functions only as a verb, adverb, and an adjective. I can subvert, I can turn subversive, and I can even act subversively. But try as hard as I might, the language prevents me from being that nasty noun, a subvert, which may reveal a political shortcoming in the culture. No matter, the dictionary, even the dictionary of record, the OED, could not confound Lenny Bruce. If Bruce loved anything in the world, it was disorder and chaos, particularly political disorder. As I say that out loud, I wonder if there's any other kind. He once told me that he prayed when he was in junior high for all the toilets to back up at once, sending a tsunami of dreck roaring down the halls. He wanted desperately to see his teachers out of control, screaming, running wildly. Imagine those clogged up toilets in the halls of Congress, he would say, and his face would light up. And so to better capture Bruce's spirit, I need to give you a glimpse of the special disorder that was the 50s in America. The tsunami of disorder that made it easier for Lenny Bruce to drive the authorities crazy. Not, as his critics say, by playing the pervert, but by taking the stage for me as America's first and number one subvert. In the 50s, this country seemed to be going mad. Maybe other countries were going mad as well, but America was losing its grip in the grandest style. Power mad, nuclear mad, end of the world mad. We were stockpiling nuclear weapons to keep the rest of the world at bay, enough weapons in a macabre accounting to kill all life on the planet 6 or 7 times over. I remember this as a kid and wondering, how could that possibly be? President Eisenhower called the strategy, with no attempt at humor, atoms for peace. The greater the number of atomic weapons, the greater the chance for peace. A full-scale nuclear war would result in the annihilation of both sides, military experts assured Americans, a defensive strategy of magnificent incoherence called mutual assured deterrence. Its twisted logic revealed in its acronym MAD. The Russians were coming, always, continually coming, and they had one aim in mind: to destroy our way of life. To walk in on that line is probably strange. You'll explain it to her, okay? Americans plastered their political choice on their American bumpers, better dead than red. For millions of Americans, death offered a much more satisfying alternative than life as a communist. Senator Joseph McCarthy believed in the Red Menace more fervently than anyone else, and he swore to God to root those commies out wherever he found them. He started with Jews in Hollywood. The little Caesar of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, climbed up on his box to sing his heart out in Joe's Hallelujah chorus, adding his own hit list: revolutionaries, anarchists, homosexuals, and for good measure, a few more Jews. In a closed briefing on Capitol Hill in 1965, General Donald R. Putt, I mean, the possibilities are fantastic. You know, they should never have done this for me, you know. Deputy Chief of Staff testified, presumably again with a straight face, that if we placed missile bases on the moon, quote, an enemy would have to launch an overwhelming nuclear attack against those bases 1 to 2 days prior to attacking the continental United States, inadvertently providing early warning. As Jon Stewart says, I can't make this up. Commenting on Putt's testimony, keep the doors closed, okay? I.F. Stone quipped in his weekly, remember I.F. Stone's weekly, that if America intended to militarize the moon, perhaps it was time for the White House to inaugurate a Department of Lunacy. General Putt was mad, McCarthy was mad, Hoover was mad, the arms race was mad. HUAC and the atomic bomb, fallout shelters, loyalty oaths, the Cold War, all madness. Fear of Fidel, fear of Pinkos, homos, lesbos, and liberal academics, fear of Negroes, fear of fear itself. I bend FDR a bit. More madness. The detonation of the H-bomb on the sexy-sounding Bikini Atoll, total madness. In a fit of certain insanity, the CIA gave up on water for its enhanced interrogations and turned instead to LSD. The Army picked up the idea in the early 50s, hoping to dose the enemy and watch them surrender to their hallucinations. They called it madness gas. The craziness, they did this all for me, in like 1952. They said, someday he'll be standing up, he should have this. The craziness did not stop there. 5 years later, in 1957, Major General William Creasy testified before Congress about the efficacy of what he called aerosol hallucinogens. Or, if that failed, of spiking enemy water supplies with LSD. Madness? Well, maybe, but if America had to lock up every last person to assure its national security, then so be it. We simply had to protect ourselves. In 1969, the United States Army inducted General Creasy into its Ordnance Hall of Fame. It's a Hall of Fame for ordnance. I can't make the regular Hall of Fame. They're doing ordnance. From the early 1950s to the early 70s, say, writers and artists began to speak of two Americas, one square and one hip. The first was bureaucratic, greedy, needy, and repressively square. And the second, free, fun, and exhilaratingly cool. The cool world shined. The hip world beckoned and enticed the young and the daring, those yearning to breathe free. That way, down the great midway of the mind, one had a chance at least of finding a revitalized sense of reality. From outside the big top, from the sidelines of the sawdust, it might look like just another form of madness, but only because most people had so seriously lost their bearings they could not recognize real freedom. In the context of a numbing and disfiguring political and social reality, psychiatrists like R.D. Laing and anthropologists like Gregory Bateson redefined madness and schizophrenia as mere interim stages in the struggle for liberation. That struggle was not easy, but easily worth the effort, for it held out the promise of authenticity and self-actualization. In short, liberation, which prompted one of the most well-known passages in the novel of the New Freedom, Jack Kerouac's On the Road. She wrote in 52, published in 57. There's a quote from it. See how many of you recognize this sentence. The only people that interest me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones that never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous Roman candles across the night. Kerouac hands us Huck Finn some 70 years later and deep inside the territory with the territory as cul-de-sac. Like Huck Finn, Sal Paradise had seen quite enough of civilization, and so he lights out, but not before he lights up. Kerouac, who wrote On the Road in 1951, was like Huck, a goofy adolescent masquerading as writer. Kerouac completed the first draft of the novel, as we now all know too well, in only 3 weeks on a 120-foot roll of paper. This is a fantastic thing. Such a headlong dive into performance and flamboyance connects the wisecracking Kerouac to the Pied Piper of the impossible, the character who, just as the 50s opened, led this march into madness. Though he was a rather obscure stand-up comic, he chose the most unabashed, regal moniker to set himself apart from the mob. And like Sal, he considers himself a big-time player in paradise itself. I refer to His Royal Highness, Lord Buckley. Do some of you know Buckley? So not only did I think I have this privileged life of meeting the right people at the right time. And then I realized that everybody's life is like that, but you have to recognize they're the right people, right? And it's the right time. So when I grew up in Hollywood, Lord Buckley was playing at the Ivar Theater, and this was big convincing because my father was basically drunk most of the time, to take me down to the theater and to get me back, and to convince the guy at the door to let me in to see Lord Buckley. That it should be a comic who led the pack makes absolute sense. Comics can so easily, so vividly, so immediately change the look of reality. On the stage, they can create more miracles than even the best of the sleight-of-hand magicians or illusionists. Richard Lord Buckley's riffing style transformed reality in small nightclubs on both coasts and influenced scores of the new wave of comedians just coming to prominence in the 50s. Those in the know took great comfort in his credo: drink a little juice, spin a little wax, and go a little crazy. If we can trace the idea of the interlocutor back to the 19th century in this country, and to minstrelsy and its Jim Crow routines of white men performing their slap-happy dances in blackface, Buckley crashed the party, put an end to burnt cork, and ushered onto the stage the era of the courageous stand-up. He was a white man, no doubt about it, but he had washed off the blackface, the masquerade of the minstrel, and seemed to have ingested a black idiom. Buckley expressed his admiration and his downright affection by extolling blackness in music and talk and walk, and most important, in attitude. Not the copycat hipster that Norman Mailer sketched out in his extended essay, White Negro. Buckley was a cooler and quieter kind of cat who saw that his emotional and spiritual survival, and perhaps the survival of the country, lay with the souls of black folk. He embodied the spirit that Ralph Ellison wrote about some 20 years after in a famous essay, which I recommend to all of you, called What Would America Be Like Without Blacks? Buckley opened every show with his signature greeting, delivered with the same wry smile and the same sweet line: "Would it embarrass you very much, my lords and ladies, if I told you that I love you?" And everybody would titter. They would squirm and titter. And it did embarrass them. The mere mention of love made them squirm. They would have to get over it. If they truly wanted to make it in the next decades, in the period that would celebrate free love, love-ins, an entire summer of love, they would simply have to shake free of their hang-ups. Nothing worse, Buckley counseled, than getting hung up on anything. Once he had got inside their hearts, Lord Buckley laid on his cats and kitties a piece of Blake-like advice. Up close and with great intensity, he urged them to dig infinity. And many of them took his invitation very seriously indeed. Lord Buckley, the professor of hippology, taught a very small segment of America, his urbane faithful, how to talk again. It was jive talk, jazz talk, Negro talk. He showed them easy breathing, and he offered them facile timing. In that professor's classroom, Jesus became his sweet double hypnotist. Shakespeare turned into Willie the Shake, and the South American explorer took to the open sea as Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, the island bumper. For Buckley, democracy demonstrated its strength and glory most dramatically through the First Amendment. Again, like Kerouac, his voice was his musical instrument, which he played to perfection. He improvised, he riffed, he laid it down. And when he laid it down, as he liked to say, it stayed down. He brought renewed freedom to freedom of speech. Talk became powerful again. The word would not be stopped. It would get out, and above the din, people would once again listen. By appropriating the rampant madness, raising it to an art form, and making it hip, Buckley helped launch the movement of liberation that took over the late 50s and 60s in this country. While he was at it, His Majesty rewrote history, changing it and charging it for his audiences with a renewed sense of the miraculous. But for all of Lord Buckley's inventions and innovations, the greatest feat for me is that he begat that skinny spritzer from Mineola, New York, Leonard Alfred Schneider, who brought to life the figments of Buckley's imagination as that wild man, Lenny Bruces. To use one of the favorite phrases of the period, Lenny Bruce helped to blow people's minds. He too fell in line as one more of those crazy cats. And like Buckley, he too leaned heavily on the First Amendment. Some said too heavily. In his buttoned-up Nehru jacket, why can't he dress normal? And his slicked-down hair, why can't he look normal? He talked dirty and periodically got arrested for opening his big mouth and refusing to close it. The First Amendment is the best strength our country has, Lenny declared from the stage. So if you take away, here it goes, as soon as we get into Bruce, my right to say, fuck you, you take away my right to say, fuck you to the government. And that he just could not have. For a country can only be strong, he insisted, when it knows all about the bad, the worst things. When it knows about the bad, then it can protect itself. This stand-up was really standing up for everything he believed in and for everything he believed the nation said it believed in. A couple of decades later, a shocking thing would take place. Richard Pryor would climb up on that same stage to tell white people what they looked and acted like, and what comedy really looked like when, instead of performing what the white man wanted and expected, a black man said what he needed to say. And Richard Pryor said many times that he owed his comic existence to Lenny Bruce, which is to say Pryor might have come much later if Bruce had not played the subvert so well. But Bruce paid an amazingly high price for taking on the Oxford English Dictionary. He lived in great psychic pain and gradually got a reputation as a junkie, and that's what stuck. People came to regard him through that one characteristic. His Royal Highness Buckley gave way to his righteous highness Bruce. Everything about Bruce seemed to be illicit. He was dangerous. He was radioactive. Don't get too close, you'll get cancer. Watch the women and children, particularly watch your sister. Both Time and Newsweek labeled Bruce a sick comic. His many fans protested. Bruce was not sick. It was society that had fallen ill, perhaps even terminally so. As the country grew madder, the comics grew smarter. Slapstick and spritz had both run their course. Humor took its leave of the belly and found a new home in the brain. Buckley had great intelligence, and Bruce blindingly so. Do you remember Oscar Levant? About people talking about Oscar Levant's knowledge of the arcane as he played the piano was astounding for me. The critics described Jack Parr as the MC of the mind. Tom Lehrer taught mathematics at Harvard. Bob Newhart held a degree in accounting. Steve Martin studied philosophy at the university in Long Beach, California. Elaine May and Mike Nichols conversed in academic talk on stage about the two brainy Alberts, Schweitzer and Einstein. Mort Saul, Mr. Current Event, could not take the stage without his New York Times. He knew world politics the way Richard Pryor knew American history. And then there were the academics manqué. Professor Irwin Corey, the world's foremost authority. and Professor Backwards, who could write upside down and or backwards, spell long words backwards, and read correctly at Evelyn Wood speed from an inverted blackboard. That was television. The key venue for the period's brand of intellectual humor, Bruce and Saul and Shelley Berman all played the same club, was located in San Francisco's North Beach and aptly named the Hungry Eye, the letter I, lowercase. Young people in this period were indeed hungry. Wherever one looked, the inmates, doubled over with laughter, threatened to take over the institution. No one seemed able to gag this new generation. not even Judge Julius Hoffman when he ordered Bobby Seale's mouth taped in the Chicago courtroom in 1967. The image is astounding if you look back at it now. It's masking, it's what's that called? Duct tape on Bobby Seale's mouth. It's just, whew. Young people wanted more and more breaking of the rules, and Bruce came through for them. His free-form bits prompted an improvisational movement that included compass players, Second City, Committee, which made stars out of Shelley Berman, Elaine May, Mike Nichols, Bob Newhart, Alan Arkin, Gilda Radner, and John Belushi. Stand Up kept standing up all across the country. If you look at the word stand up or try to find it in the dictionary, you'll find that it's an Americanism. It doesn't appear other places. And I asked lots of our visiting writers from various parts of the world if stand up really was part of their culture, and it turns out it was not. It's sometimes imported, but only in here and off in Britain. The names came in rapid succession: Red Fox, Richard Pryor, Andy Kaufman, later Chris Rock, Eddie Murphy, Margaret Cho, and on and on. I teach a class now still in Portland, Oregon, and I did at Claremont, called The History of Laughter. And I play, I made the mistake of playing, I still think as funny as the Abbott and Costello who's on first for the students, and they said, my God, what were you people doing? You know, it's like, what, that's funny? But I also play Lenny Bruces for them, and they have a hard time getting it. There's so much that one has, not let alone all the Yiddish you have to teach them, you know, but I mean, to get them up on history is just astounding. And then the comics just come every 5 minutes. You know, as they say to me, I'm 15 minutes ago, you know, about the things I like. The Borscht Belt and the Catskills, safe havens of safe Yiddish humor for so many years, could close their doors forever. New and wild and at times totally incomprehensible acts took over comedy. Alien for many and seditious for those in power, the new acts did more than capture young people's imagination. They put fire in their hearts. They turned many of them into activists. Rules were for the decidedly unhip and the square and the dullest of the dull. All those far-out fringe performances could not be stopped. In a few short years, the various subversions would spill into the streets as happenings, be-ins, love-ins, and different forms of guerrilla performances, from Julian Beck's Living Theater in the mid-50s in New York City, still the greatest, I think, for me, dramatic performance that I've ever seen, to Luis Valdez's Teatro Campesino in the early 60s in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley. Novels, plays, movies, poems, work of nonfiction, and music, oh my God, that rock and roll, suddenly acted in the most un-American manner. Magazines, too, like Ramparts, originally a Catholic quarterly, took a hard left turn when Robert Scheer took over as editor, and developed a roster of subversive writers like Noam Chomsky, Cesar Chavez, Seymour Hersh, Tom Hayden, Angela Davis, and on and on. Even the world of comic books got in on the subversive act, like the new and zany and aptly named Mad Magazine. It still brings, aimed presumably at young people, but which enjoyed a remarkable popularity with adults. From its first issue in October 1952, I think it's also the 50th anniversary, it is the 50th anniversary of the committee, or Second City, is that right? I mean, and they're performing, I think, right? So it was first issue, October 1952, Mad blew holes in almost everything the government and the country held dear, but most especially, you remember this, war and spying. And oh yes, the government itself. Remember Spy versus Spy? Came true, right? It just came home. While J.D. Salinger does not give us this detail, I can imagine Holden Caulfield, who first appeared in 1952, in his dormitory room at Pensy Prep, reading the first issue of Mad Magazine. Holden's that off, that quizzical, that bright, and his poignant way of seeing the world wounds him seriously. Another young man wounded in his youth, Allen Ginsberg, became Holden's shadow. On one beatified evening, October 7th, 1956, at the Six Art Gallery in San Francisco, Ginsberg turned Whitman's barbaric yawp into a Lear-like howl. So many people, even young people today, can recognize those opening lines. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. America had not heard such chest-heaving honesty in its verse since Leaves of Grass. The 50s became a fact. One knew it because young people began quoting William Blake once again. They may not know who it was, but they knew the lines were good. Potheads migrated from the jazz jukes onto college campuses. Gracie Slick ran into Alice as she turned 10 feet tall. Jim Morrison broke on through to the other side. Dylan let the folks at Gertie's Folk City know in no uncertain times that the times were truly changing. The drugs, mushrooms, peyote, and LSD perfectly suited those unsuited times. What is an acid trip but madness in Motley on Parade? Even in art, Jackson Pollock, affectionately known as Jack the Dripper, covered his canvases with multicolored splotches and blotches, driving critics to extremes in their attempt to make sense out of such high-strung spontaneity. De Kooning and Rothko, too, gave the critics fits. What do those paintings mean? Nothing was the standard answer. And everything was also the standard answer. How exasperating, how utterly fitting, how downright maddening. The madness was not just free-range zaniness, but madness designed to turn things upside down, to subvert. Like the improvised jazz playing behind him, Bruce's riffs of the imagination offered a glimpse at non-scripted self-discovery. Here was madness then, but Hamlet's brand of madness, North by Northwest. Not a bad title for a movie when I think about it. Creating madmen with a keen awareness of their own maddening behavior. Madmen like Holden, like Yossarian, like Lenny Bruce, and Ginsberg's angel-headed hipsters of the night. Inside the nightclubs, one entered a Mad Hatter's tea party with comedians passionately teaching the truth of things, eager to uncover the reality behind the reality. What Bruce talked about indeed seemed mad, especially near the end of his career when he described cops playing the part of Lenny Bruce as comic in the courtroom, reproducing his act word for word with the worst possible timing anyone can imagine. The criminal justice system, designed to protect the average citizen, had been hit by madness as well. Work to undo it, Bruce said. Subvert it, take it apart. He urged all those things. Bruce made people laugh. Sometimes it seemed against their wills, with a series of strange, wonderfully surreal routines. They consisted of underground truths hauled into the light. Without uttering a word, just by sharing the stage with the black jazz musician Eric Miller in the mid-50s, Bruce corralled his audience into a conspiracy of subversion. Probably everyone remembers the Defiant Ones of Sidney Poitier, chained to Tony Curtis. Imagine such a thing. And they having to talk to each other. Eric Miller and Lenny Bruce came out on the stage. This is the first time I saw them chained together. And Bruce says, I will teach you Yiddish. And Eric Miller says, I don't understand the words you use. He says, I'll teach you Yiddish if you tell me all about what you eat and how you walk and how you talk. It was amazing. In a burlesque house, no less, with strippers periodically, as I remember. So without uttering a word, just by sharing the stage with the black jazz musician Eric Miller in the mid-50s, Bruce corralled his audience into a conspiracy of subversion. Those two, comedian and musician, talked openly about the possibilities of friendship between a black man and a white man well before the civil rights movement. With his piercing wit, he surprised and sometimes even repulsed audiences. Bruce talked revolution in 1956, and lots of people did not like to hear it, did not want to hear it. He took the stage many nights and repeated the N-word until people either left the room, laughed, or waited for Bruce to talk about the enormous power we give to words whenever we suppress them. Keep in mind that when Bruce took the stage, the Selma March had not yet taken place. Civil rights movement had not yet taken shape in this country. The war in Vietnam was still a hushed secret. The free speech movement at least 6 or 7 years away. Subversion meant, in the simplest terms, in the Renaissance Room on the Sunset Strip in West Hollywood in 1957, to me, nothing more than let's talk about race. Let's talk about everything. Let's not shy away from a single thing. Let's speak to each other about all those subjects that America has wanted to keep quiet its entire history. It was my education going to hear him. Without Bruce, without the wild man of laughter, political activism, and the politics of liberation, I believe, would have taken longer to take off. He filled each performance with the most outrageous observations that few had cared to comment on before, like the sheer opulence of most organized religion, the absurdity of pot busts, the crudity of sexual repression, and, as I said, the horrific unfairness of the criminal justice system in this country, especially, he talked in 1957 to people of color. He refused to stop his digging until he had excavated the truth in every category imaginable. We would all have to work hard and with diligence to find the truth of things, but find the truth we must, and he demanded nothing less than that from his audience. The government developed its policies best when its citizens lived in fear. Pot, he insisted, would only be legalized when the children of congressmen and congresswomen got busted for getting high. Lenny Bruce did his teaching well. The anti-war movement, again, I believe, would have taken off in this country much later without Bruce's coaching. To listen to Bruce meant to experience both pleasure and pain. If you found him funny and took him seriously, the two things work together, I think. If you found him funny and took him seriously, you just might have to change your life or the country, or both. This growing movement of subverting the norm and the normal gave us the Beats, Rebels Without Apparent Causes, Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, Dr. Strangelove, the Magic Christian, the hippies, the yippies, communes and collectives, love-ins, be-ins, happenings, guerrilla theater, anti-war demonstrations, and civil rights marches. It generated hope for a new world, a new way of living, a new consciousness, an everlasting change. At times, all that activity seemed terribly febrile, immature, romantic, highly idealistic, even juvenile. But one belief held it all together. The received, installed, organizing adult world had fallen flat. And it was time for a new way of seeing, a new way of being, and thus a new way of doing. William Blake spoke to young people on gigantic posters, cleanse the doors of perception, and see the world as it truly is, infinite. Of course, there were casualties along the way. An awful lot of people believed they could fly and burned their brightly colored tie-dye wings. Others really wanted to see the infinite, and in the process discovered they were tragically finite. The obituary includes many names we know: Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Mama Cass, Jim Morrison, Harry Nilsson, Brian Jones, Graham Parsons, Elvis Presley, Kurt Cobain, John Belushi, Chris Farley, a personal favorite, and probably thousands more whose names we do not know and probably will never know. At a certain moment, the madness intensified. While a good deal of white society could not embrace the civil rights movement, they could at least abide Martin Luther King and his avowed commitment to nonviolence. But when Malcolm X began to talk of black nationalism or Pan-Africanism and something he called by any means necessary, this demand for liberation had gone too damn far. For the overwhelming majority of the country, Malcolm X stood at the fringes and embodied true madness. A 1950 FBI report quotes Malcolm X as saying, quote, "Everyone has always said that Malcolm is crazy, so it isn't hard to convince people that I am." Off the pigs, kill Whitey. Black Panthers began shouting these threats near the end of the 60s after the assassination of King and Malcolm X, as they began patrolling their own neighborhoods in Oakland and Compton and creating their own breakfast and tutoring programs for black kids in the poorest of poor inner city neighborhoods. In 1965, fierce anger at a system that had kept blacks oppressed for centuries erupted in flames in the city of Watts. Detroit turned fiery 2 years later. Harlem went next. The images it saw in the national news gave a good deal of white America the chance to finally say, just as we feared, the nation has fallen headfirst into true madness. And on top of that, look who's taking us there. The following year, on August 3rd, 1966, newspapers carried Bruce's obituary. Some included a gruesome photograph of him sprawled dead on a bathroom floor, a hypodermic syringe close by. The headlines read, "Sick comic Lenny Bruce dead of an apparent overdose." How ironic that America's principal potty mouth should die in a bathroom. The exploitation of madness, or more accurately, of seeming madness, as a way towards political subversion and liberation may be one of the longest and most dramatic underground themes in history, running all the way from the Middle Ages to the present. Certainly, the 19th century, with its symbolists, surrealists, dandies, druggies, and inverts, what one could be a noun in the 19th century called an invert. Not an extrovert, but an invert, that's someone who turns things upside down sexually. Homosexuals were called inverts. Made madness a topic of popular discussion. It may have only become more intensified, refined and polished, and certainly more politicized and above ground beginning in the 50s in America. Its principal subject for me, out of Lenny Bruce, is race. I see the pursuit of that madness and its accompanying spirit of subversion, not just persisting, but growing in this country until well into the 80s. I mark not exactly its end, but at least its withering, this may sound, with the publication of Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance in 1982. You remember it? It came in different colors. You could buy different. An extended meditation on quality and the way obsession of any sort, even about quality, can drive a person mad. It is not a particularly funny book. After taking the reader on a rather triumphal ride over some 300 pages, the novel ends with a rather disheartening scene. I'm getting towards the end. Another 2-3 hours, and we'll break our fast. Pirsig finishes, I only have one more page. Pirsig finishes his cross-country motorcycle tour of the United States, his son on the back of his bike the entire time, at the West Coast in the late afternoon at a fairly pristine patch of the beach. They sit for some time watching the sun setting over the Pacific. The father finally breaks the mood saying, did we not see some amazing sights in those 3,000 or 4,000 miles? And to jog the son's memory, he slowly begins ticking them off. The son remains silent for 2 or 3 beats too long, and then looking his father in the eyes confesses, "Dad, most of the trip, all I saw was the back of your neck." He knows how to kill a father. Right? It is a statement, a cheesy statement perhaps, but Pirsig, I think, means it to reverberate with meaning. At the end of that glorious ride throughout the liberating 60s, with all its sound and all of its fury, a lot of people may have witnessed nothing more than the back of the person's neck in front of them. But then again, maybe that's enough, the nape of the neck. Pirsig admires the beats and their commitment to Buddhism, and he may have ended his book with a crucial expression of Maya, of nothingness, as homage to that philosophy. The reader needs some explanation like that, for he or she puts in an awful lot of time just to be told at the end that the journey meant not very much. For me, then, the Sun's reply represents the collapse into something new and different, into normalcy, I suppose, into the boom of the late 80s and 90s, when the economy took off, bloating lifestyles out of all recognition, when the action moved north of North Beach, out of the coexistence bagel shop and into the Silicon Valley. You don't get coffee shops like that now, right, with that name? Coexistence bagel shop. If you say, well, what about the continuing revolutionary shove from the punk rock movement? I answer that punks pursue the other meaning of mad, anger and outrage. Yes, the Clash and the Ramones and the Sex Pistols were still raging against the machine, but they shouted their message to a more and more insulated and isolated audience. They did not seem capable or willing to let a lot of the population in on the fun. When Bob Dylan sings the refrain, "Lenny Bruce is dead," he seems to be saying that the man and the sentiment have both passed from us forever. The explosion in technology, the phenomenon of the Silicon Valley, both in the money people made and the techniques they marketed, helped in good part to put an end to the beatific vision of madness that coursed like so much adrenaline throughout the period I have outlined. Money, as we know, can subvert only too well. The computer encourages its own kind of neatness and exactness. Everything entered precisely, a single letter or dot can create an entirely different result miles off the mark. I can still, of course, write the chant of Molderar on the word processor, but I am fully aware of a program shadowing my prose, a program that permits me certain liberties. If I really want to bust out of the linear order of composition, I must enter the world of hypertext, but even that, of course, requires following a program. Or I must leave the screen altogether and rely on my pencil and my legal pad. Self-understanding, self-revelation, a deep and powerful exploration of interiority proves more difficult, I think, in the age of technology. In the computer age, even young kids talk glibly about the self continually splitting and splintering and maybe even disappearing. As the joke goes, online, no one knows you're a dog. Most young people now believe that computers, not they, have all the power, and we are left, we cast-offs of the new cyber culture, to merely accessing documents, uploading information, and the ultimate downer for me, downloading data. The closest we can come today to Bruce's mad riffs is to go off in some chat room where such uncontrolled and undignified behavior gets quickly dismissed as ranting or flaming. Recently, New York publishers have even offered for sale manuals for composing email messages, which actually turn out to be less like style sheets and more like etiquette manuals. And digging infinity, well, that ever-vanishing point exists, I guess, somewhere in cyberspace. Wikipedia and chat rooms and blogs turn everyone with a keyboard into an instant expert. Finishing this piece, I began to wonder about the idea of the subvert. Is it, as I said earlier, a flaw in the culture that subvert does not exist as a carefully defined category? Or is it worse than that? For one can act in subversive ways, and those acts, as Joe McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover like to point out, can be wide-ranging and ever-changing. As the Red Queen might say, subversion is whatever I say it is. I like thinking of J. Edgar Hoover as the Red Queen. But that's just me. I can even imagine a diagnostic medical manual including a disease called SSD, subversive spectrum disorder. So perhaps not having the idea of a subvert permits the authorities to cast the dragnet farther and wider in hunting down subversive behavior, far beyond what a simple definition of subvert would allow. It certainly permitted the Los Angeles Police Department to hound Lenny Bruce to his death. For me, that's what killed Bruce. Not an overdose of heroin, but a very powerful overdose of the LAPD. No matter, he's dead. A few short days after his death, Bruce's major record label, Reprise Records placed an ad in Ramparts magazine which read, "Go ahead, listen. It's safe now, he's dead. We might want to listen to Lenny Bruce again. Indeed, we may need to listen to Lenny Bruce again."